Okay, so let's talk about how far William changes the government and administration of England. This is a very popular exam question. It comes up very often, I suppose, because it's probably one of the most interesting, one of the most significant things to talk about. And it's a valid question, and it really gives you the opportunity as an A-level student to discuss what changes and what continues. This is essential historical understanding to be able to demonstrate that you understand how much something changes, and it's to demonstrate this awareness that things can change while remaining the same. And this gives you ample opportunity to demonstrate this level of awareness. And for those of you going on to higher education to do a degree in history or associated subjects, this is really the skill that you're going to need to work on. Beyond the simple, it changes, it stays the same. And oh, excuse me. Basically, what we've got is that William doesn't really change the fundamentals of how the Saxon system works. As I mentioned in the last video about how he maintains control, part of his genius is that he doesn't change things where they don't need changing. But just because he doesn't revolutionize much, there is nothing that's left unchanged. Everything is affected. But this underpinned by a huge amount of continuity. First thing which I'll need to talk about, I'm just going to talk about briefly, is this idea of the feudalist system of feudalism, which of course we need to understand. I can't talk about the feudal system here. I think perhaps I'll do a different video on that, but that will be looking at the whole period 1066 to 1216. That's a much more interesting way of looking at it. But suffice to say that William introduces this practice that is called by later historians feudalism, the feudal system, and it's based on this system of oath taking and military service, which we'll need to talk about as a separate issue, I think. The Doomsday Survey itself is really what gives us, and the Salisbury Oath, these are what give us this knowledge of how this, I hate doing that, sorry, of how this feudal system worked. So this is new. There's nothing quite like this in Saxon England. There is, of course, the hierarchical society, and we've got earls and earls. We've got barons and knights replacing thanes, but it's similar. But this idea of swearing oaths and everything based upon military service, this is something new. And this is part of the genius of the Norman administration, not just William, but his sons and later successors, is this ability to really wring as much cash as you can out of this system, which they do spectacularly well and terribly badly at some points. Rufus and John particularly sort of jump to mind as people who exploit the system too much, but I digress. So this is a change. We'd need to talk about the feudal system and feudalism as something that's entirely new, and this gives you a chance to show off your knowledge about Doomsday and what that entailed. Again, that requires a video of its own, I would imagine. So we've got that. We've got the more militaristic nature. Under William, we can begin to talk about this almost being martial law, that England becomes almost a state under martial law. This is very different to Edward's reign. We looked at Edward's reign thinking about changing continuity, that Edward seems to have ended the Hair Guild and disbanded the fleet, all of these things seeming towards like a really sort of not pacifist but not militaristic, and we sometimes judge Edward poorly because of this lack of seeming lack of military ambition. This is very different under William, and of course, combined with this, we've got the building of castles, so which I spoke about previously. So we've got this much more militaristic style of government. So this is a change. The other obvious change is, of course, who's in charge. The Normans are in charge. This is new, but but, a big but, is if you're a Saxon peasant, working in the fields down in the outskirts of Salisbury or in Dorset or up in York, how much does your life change? I don't know. Probably not a great deal. The person in charge might speak French, but it's the level of change to, let's call them you and I, the normal people's lives, it probably isn't that significant. And now this is where it's really interesting to talk about continuity, but change within continuity. So, for example, the geld is still collected annually. It's still based on the old Hyde, hundred, and shire system. So this hasn't changed. This is still exploited, and this is still the annual tax. The difference is William is collecting more, so that there's a lot more talk of what's known as the Norman yoke, where the Normans are really oppressing the Saxons and sort of dragging the money from them. Odo and Fitzosborne really come in for it on this when William goes back to Normandy in 1067. These are really sort of the blame in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is placed on these guys. So we've got using existing efficient systems, but then altering them, making them more Norman, making them more efficient, we could say. If you live at the time, you'd have probably said it was ruthless. For us looking back at it, we can say, well, this is a more efficient form of tax collection. I've already mentioned the land division remains the same. The Hyde, the hundred, the shire, the earldom. Of course, what William does is he reduces the size and the power of the earls. He doesn't want to find himself in the same position that Edward did with Earl Godwin, where Godwin and then later Harold are almost perhaps of well, not of comparable, but of approaching the power of the king. William is very, very keen to make sure that this doesn't happen. Tied up with this is the power of the sheriff. So the sheriff already existed in Saxon England. This isn't a Norman invention, but again, there's a change. The power of the sheriffs increase. Sorry, I was just thinking about the other course where we can look at the power of the sheriff increasing right the way through up and through into Stephen's reign, etc. But just focusing now on the reign of William. So the sheriff is an important individual. He's holding court, literally, at the Shire Court. The Shire Courts, the Hundred Courts, these continue to meet. At these meetings, at the Shire Court, the Hundred Courts, royal proclamations are announced. This is a chance for the normal people, the peasantry, to be in touch with royalty, to be in touch with the king and his power. It's a visible display of power, of Norman power. I was talking in the last video about crown wearings, and we can think about these meetings of the Shire Court, the Hundred Court, as similar in a way. It's a reaffirmation. It's a town hall meeting. It's a reaffirmation of Norman power. But again, it's something that already exists. William is building on existing systems. The other obvious example of this, of course, is the Chancery. So the Chancery exists in Saxon England. The sending out of writs and charters, this exists. This practice doesn't exist in this way in Normandy. It exists brilliantly in Saxon England. William comes and adopts an approach of if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. It works, so let's continue using it. We can make this sort of, to be honest, a little bit lazy statement that the language of the writs are written in changes. More importantly, I think is there's more. We're seeing an increasing level of administration, and again this increasing level of efficiency. This is tied up with, of course, under William the Conqueror, for the first time, we need cross-channel government. Edward and his predecessors don't face this, the need to deal with this cross-channel government. William needs to govern two lands at once. And so in order to do this, you need to establish a more sophisticated bureaucracy. And already under William, we see perhaps the beginnings of the civil service that's going to develop into the famous Norman developments in government. But again, looking at the Chancery, it's an existing system. So let's have a think about what we've spoken about so far. So feudalism, this is new. I mentioned in the last video about the forest law, the merge and find. These are innovations. Of course, it's more militaristic. We've got trial by battle. However, the vast majority is just an expansion of existing systems. So what William does, and what marks him out, I think personally, as such a, perhaps as a visionary, as a great king, a genuinely great king, is his ability to adapt and utilize existing systems. So the Chancery, the Witan becomes the Great Council, but it's still the Witan. William continues to use Saxon earls until it becomes untenable. He keeps land division very, very similar. Crucially, he's collecting the geld in just the same way that the Saxons had collected it previously. He maintains trial by ordeal. So there's this continuity, but this is tied up with what I was talking about in the previous video, and you need to think about these two things side by side, that this is tied up with, I'm in control, you are now a conquered people. And there's no doubt that William is asserting his authority in this way. His genius is his ability to adapt existing systems and make them work specifically for him, and specifically in a Norman way. They are not working in a Saxon way anymore. They are working in a Norman way. So, to what extent does William change the government and administration of England? He revolutionizes it. He changes it completely, but at the same time, he does nothing of the sort. He barely changes a thing. That's something to think about, isn't it? That's if you can argue that one way or the other. It's what makes this an interesting question, what makes it a popular question. You can make a perfectly valid historical argument one way or the other. The crucial thing which you must not do is contradict yourself and go halfway through, oh, he changes everything, but he changes nothing. You say that he changes lots of things, but it's all based upon this continuity. So if you can get that nuance into your argument, that level of sophistication, that things are changing but remaining the same, then you're hitting your high band, your band 5, your band 6. It's complicated. It needs breaking down into further sections of this, but this is just like as you're aware, a revision session. All right, thanks.